Today I'm going to show you how to cover a cake in fondant icing. You will need 2 cakes, a cake board, preferably a turntable, fondant icing, icing sugar, jam, a cake smoother, a tape measure. This is one I only use for cake decorating, a cake scraper, a thin bread knife, a normal knife, a palette knife, buttercream, and a rolling pin. Firstly, we will cut the layers of the cake. We will cut 4 layers into the 2 cakes. You can buy cake levelers, but I've found with the cheap ones they tear the cake up. I've found the best way to get even layers is to use a cheap bread knife and a tape measure. The cheap bread knife tends to be thin, which is perfect for cutting the cake without tearing it. If you measure the side of your cake and make a small cut where 2 centimetres is, then continue this by doing this all around the cake. Once you have all your marks around the cake, take your bread knife and carefully cut in to join the marks up. Once they're joined up, continue to cut into the side of the cake using the line you have just made by joining them up. Carefully cut in a bit more each time you go round. This will cut the cake into an even layer. This process will need to be repeated again for this cake, and then a further 2 times with the second cake you have, making the 4 layers we need. Next, we will assemble the layers of the cake. I have used a board 2 inches larger than my cake, but you can have your board as big or as small as you need. So firstly, put a small bit of buttercream in the middle of your board. This will act as a glue to keep your cake in place. Place the first layer on the board, which will be one of the bottom layers, so you have the crust on the board. Then spread your first filling in. I personally prefer to have jam, then buttercream, then jam, but you can have it in whichever order you prefer. You could have all jam layers or you could have all buttercream layers. I'm spreading the jam on with my normal knife. The next layer will be one of the middle layers. Line it up so it fits perfectly on top of the bottom layer. Next, I have put my buttercream layer in, which I've used the palette knife to spread this on. Don't worry too much about being too neat with any of the layers, as putting the layers on top will mean that it will smooth out. Next will be the third layer, which will be your last remaining middle layer of cake. Your third filling will be the final filling. So for this one I have used jam, which I'm using the normal knife to spread. Once that layer is complete, then put your final layer of cake on top. This should be the final bottom layer with the crust on top. Next we will crumb coat the cake. Take your buttercream and spread all around the sides of the cake, pushing the buttercream into the cake and down to the bottom of the board. Then take your cake scraper and scrape off any excess buttercream off the sides so you are left with the smooth finish. Next we will crumb coat the top of the cake. Spread your buttercream on top of the cake, making sure you cover all of the cake. Then use the cake scraper to remove any excess buttercream. Once you've removed all the excess buttercream, you will then need to put your cake in the fridge for about half an hour to an hour to allow the buttercream to set, because we're going to crumb coat it again to make sure that the cake is lovely and smooth. Using the same method as before, we're going to crumb coat the cake. So spread the buttercream all over the sides of the cake and then use your cake scraper to scrape off any excess buttercream. Then put your cake back into the fridge for another half an hour to allow the buttercream to set. By crumb coating it twice, it means we have a lovely, even, smooth finish for when we put our fondant icing on top, which will leave a better finish overall. While the cake is setting, you will need to knead your fondant icing. When kneading a lot of icing, use the heel of your hand to push into the icing, then pick it up and turn it. By picking it up, it will stop the icing sticking to your surface, meaning you won't need to use icing sugar at this point. Using too much icing sugar with fondant icing can make the icing go dry and it will crack easily. Keep kneading it until it is warm and malleable. Next we will roll out the icing. Sprinkle icing sugar onto your work surface. Using your rolling pin, start to roll out your icing. After a few rolls, pick it up and turn it. This ensures the icing doesn't stick to your work surface. You can check your icing will fit by measuring it. Both sides of the cake are 8 centimetres and the top is just under 16, making the total I will need 8 by 8 by 16, which is 32 centimetres. I'm cutting off the excess which I won't need. Having too much rolled icing can cause the icing to tear when you're putting it on the cake. Next, take the rolling pin and place in the middle of the rolled icing. Fold the icing over the rolling pin and then lift the icing up. This means you can lift it up and put it on the cake easily. Match up the bottom edge with the bottom edge of the cake and gently place over the cake. Then, working as quick as you can, smooth the icing on top of the cake and around the top of the sides of the cake, and then work down and around to smooth out the icing and folds. If your icing does rub at all, it's easy to correct it. Just put the icing together as much as you can, and then either using the tips of your fingers or the ball of your hand, apply a small amount of pressure to join the icing back up. It's just the heat you need from the hand which will get the icing to join back up. I'll show you again later though how to do this on a close-up version. I'm just using the side of my hand here to push the icing down onto the board to create a seal around the bottom. Next, take your cake scraper and you're going to just gently rub across the top of the cake and then down and around the sides of the cake just to smooth out that icing. And here I'm just using the side of the scraper to push down on the board to create that seal at the bottom of the cake again. Now I'm just using a knife to cut off the excess icing from around the board. Now I'm just going to remove the excess icing. Now I'm just going to use the cake smoother again, just to go over the sides of the cake again to make sure that icing is lovely and smooth. And again, just using the side of the cake scraper to push the icing down onto the cake board just to make sure that seals nice and tight. It's also going to make it easier to cut off when you need to get close to the cake. Now, just using the sharp knife, I'm going to get as close as I can to the cake to cut the icing off the board as I can. I'm just going to take it a little at a time. The more you do, the more likely you are to make a mistake. And as promised before, here's a close-up of if you tear or rip the icing. Just using the tips of your fingers or the ball of your hand, just gently rub the tear in a circular motion to join the icing back up. It's the heat from your fingers that will bring the icing back together, so you don't need to use any water at all. And thank you very much for watching my guide on how to ice a cake.